All right, in this video, we're going to take a look at headaches. Headaches are definitely something that we see all the time in practice. One of the first things we'll mention is that they're often a symptom of other patterns. What we want to look at in this video is how do we start to differentiate headaches and how to identify the patterns that underlie them, and like always, so that we can most effectively treat the headaches. So let's take a look now at some of the causes and some of the treatments we use for headaches. As we've just mentioned, there are many causes of headaches, and probably the most important thing to remember is that headaches are usually a symptom. There might be a few times where we can say a headache is the main, I can actually think of one, so maybe we can't say that, but headaches are something that we see, and in treating headaches, there's some things we can generally do to treat headaches, but for the most part, the most important thing we do almost always identify the underlying cause or pattern. We're going to view in this set of videos, kind of unlike our previous pain videos, we're going to see some patterns we're probably a little more familiar with. Treatment then naturally flows from addressing or resolving this pattern. Let's look a little bit about the generalizations. This helps you identify what is happening and hopefully maybe the zong fu or the vital substance that is out of balance the most. Location, one of the first questions we ask about headaches, of course, are what's the location, what's the character. Vertex headaches are usually blood deficiency. Now, I'm going to have to use the word usually often in describing all of this because although some of these things are quite reliable, we do see variations. Absolutely, we see variations. And because patterns can, of course, overlap, we might see it primarily as a vertex headache, but it's really also, we also see it behind the eyes. So can that mean that it can't be one or the other? No, we can have a blood deficiency. We can certainly have a liver blood deficiency. So we may see these things overlapping. Don't use these as a guide, but don't get too attached to, oh, if I see it in this area, it has to be this. It's another tool to help us understand what's going on. Vertex headaches, usually think blood deficiency. This next one, though, is a little more reliable. Behind the eyes is almost always liver. There are a couple other patterns that'll do it, but liver is usually what we see here. The liver, as I'm sure you remember, manifests in the eyes. Well, the Shen manifests in the eyes. The liver opens into the eyes. And so when we see anything happening with the eyes, we often think of the liver. Sinus, however, which can feel like behind the eyes, this can tell us that there is dampness or congestion. Now that's still a little bit related to the liver, but more because the liver, of course, smooth flow of qi and blood. But if it's a sinus headache pattern, that almost always tells us there's dampness. And the most common causes of dampness are spleen or kidney qi or spleen or kidney yang deficiencies. This one shows up often enough that I've included it here, but I can't say I correlate this one clinically nearly as often. Frontal headaches related to stomach meridian. Now you see the word meridian here as in contrast to zong fu. The stomach meridian does run through this area, and so we might say this is a stomach meridian pattern. If you say, whoa, what's a stomach meridian pattern? It means obstruction of the stomach meridian or failure of the flow of qi through the meridian. That might be causing the headache. I can't really say I see this as much, but I want to include it because it shows up often enough. Temporal headaches, this is usually qi stagnation. I highlight qi stagnation here more so than liver or gallbladder. This is sort of your almost classic qi stagnation, frustration, stress. You get that temporal headache. You get people pressing on the sides of their heads. We do this automatically when we feel frustration, stagnation. So your fairly classic, often what we might even call cluster headaches, are usually related to the liver, and they're usually derived from qi stagnation, which of course is related to the liver. Occipital headaches are also often related to the liver, but we do see them in wind conditions, wind invasions as well. And then if we have a whole head headache, this is usually a cold wind invasion. Just the whole head hurts. Sometimes people even say it feels empty. I didn't write that here, but that's sometimes how that's characterized. So those locations help us. Oh, we do have dull down here. Dull and vacuous. There we go. These locations help us get some insight, and character also helps us gain some insight as to what's happening. Sharp, stabbing, and fixed. You should remember this from our previous videos. This tells us there is a blood stasis or fixed obstruction. This is pretty reliable, and usually qi stagnation we'll move towards this. You can have pretty stabbing pains, but if you remember that the pain of qi stagnation is usually diffuse and distending, that's more a pressure or a headache that can feel like something pressing out or a band. If someone says, yeah, it hurts right here, usually this tells us there's some blood stasis or obstruction. Dull headaches, like we talked about general characters of pain. These are usually deficiency of qi or blood. Same thing with vacuous or empty, and this is also a little bit true of constricting, like there is a band pulling in. These are usually blood deficiency. We can also see these from kidney deficiency. The idea of this is like actually that there's not enough qi or even enough jing to sort of manifest properly the brain, and it feels like the space is empty or deficient. It's obviously not literally empty, but this is one of the descriptions there. I included it again because we see it show up in some of the TCM books, but mostly if we have a vacuous or empty feeling, think blood deficiency and maybe qi deficiency. Heaviness or congestion, we don't really need too much thinking to know that this is damp or phlegm. And distending or throbbing, this is usually liver yang rising. Now, liver yang rising is an excess pattern. We can see this in yin deficiency as well, but distending or throbbing, this tells us there is stagnation, but there's also more characteristically, there's heat rising up. Some people even say their head feels hot. Now, of course, we can have some of these in combination. We can have a heavy, throbbing headache. We can have one that feels congested and distending. So this tells us there's liver yang rising and there's dampness. This gives us a damp heat pattern. These are often much worse. When we start to combine some of these, this is where the headaches tend to worsen. We're mostly talking about headaches in this video series. We're not so much talking about migraines. We'll mention them a little bit. Migraines tend to be different patterns, and migraines are perhaps less of a symptom than what we've seen so far. Migraines are quite difficult to treat in a lot of cases. Sometimes really bad headaches get described as migraines, and when we can find the underlying pattern, for example, a damp heat liver yang rising certainly can feel like a migraine, but it is a little bit different if you dig into the symptoms. However, it's a lot easier to treat than sometimes true migraines, which you've probably heard me say in class before, some of the most difficult things I've seen in practice in terms of cases that I've really not had great success with. Headaches were usually pretty good. Migraines, a little less so. Sometimes quite a bit less so, if I'm honest. Onset, rapid onset, and rapid clearing. This always tells us wind. That's usually related to external wind, but we certainly see this in internal wind as internal wind becomes pronounced. We get rapid, sometimes sharp and focal, but we get rapid onset headaches. Gradual onset with persistent duration. This tells us for sure that's an internal pattern. I kind of like this. I feel like there is actually a little bit of usefulness in this. I hadn't really thought about this actually that much before. Daytime is usually a qi or a yang deficiency. You get into the day or the afternoon, you're just running out of qi and yang, and you start to get that deficient headache pattern, around 3 o'clock. Probably you've been staring at a computer screen. That's certainly not helping. That's probably giving you some stagnation as well, but a daytime headache is sort of that running out of energy. Evening, blood or yin deficiency. That means you've actually gone a little bit further. And nighttime headaches, these are stasis patterns. These are usually quite a bit more significant. It's a question we almost always ask about headaches. When do you get the pain? And I hadn't really thought so much about the daytime or evening, but often what I'm screening for is nighttime. If they say, I get a headache that wakes me up from sleep, that usually tells us, yeah, we've got a blood stasis pattern, and a blood stasis pattern is definitely more serious than a qi or yang deficiency. So we actually will look at things differently and perhaps even go a little further in our workup to make sure that there's not something more risky coming down the tracks. Etiological factors creating headaches. There are quite a number of them. We'll spend a lot of time talking about the internal disharmonies from the patterns that we see, but let's look a little bit in general. Pathogenic factors of pretty much all of them. Wind, heat, cold, and dampness can all create headaches. Now, we don't have phlegm. We don't have, I guess we do have dampness, but we don't have stagnation up here. These are all associated with headaches. Wind often refers to the onset of pain. There are other ways to relate wind in here, but mostly if we talk about wind, it usually has to do with how fast it happens. When wind combines with heat, we have disruption of qi and blood, and this gives us a headache. When wind combines with cold, we get a congesting, a congealing that creates an obstruction of the flow of qi and yang and blood. A lot of headaches are the outcome of changes in the flow of, we would say conventionally, just blood, but in TCM we would extend that to say qi and blood to the brain in particular. And when wind occurs, it means those changes have happened too quickly and the brain has been unable to compensate, so we get a disruption of the smooth flow of qi and blood to the head. That is why the liver is almost always indicated in headaches, because we can view headaches pretty reliably as a disruption. Sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's too little, but we have a disruption of the flow of qi and blood to the head, particularly the brain, but often you'll see it written as the head. Dampness will create an obstruction of qi that creates headaches. Yep, probably that is pretty easy to understand. When we're talking about external pathogenic factors, and this does get us into some of the migraine stuff, which I find interesting, because changes in weather, we can all agree this is a real thing. Changes in weather, changes in pressure, general changes in climate and environment. People who are sensitive, people who tend to get migraines, I don't think they're making this part up. We see it again and again and again. So there definitely seems to be some truth. We don't have a fantastic reason why. We think, okay, changes in pressure, change the way maybe the blood-brain barrier works, change other things. At least I don't know a fantastic reason why, although I know some have been proposed. But we definitely see this pretty reliably. One of the things that I've seen, especially with migraines, and this is probably useful to note, especially with the migraines that I've found very difficult to treat, here in Toronto, when we do start to talk about, is there anything, I often ask it as an open-ended question, is there anything that has ever made it better? And more than once, I think I could say at least 3 times, someone has said, when I went for a vacation down to the desert, and often it's around Arizona, somewhere like that, they say, I didn't get a headache or migraine for an entire week. So this is where we talk about external pathogenic factors, particularly of colds. It's cold here most of the time, but even more so, dampness. We've got a lot of dampness here. And Toronto in particular, because of our proximity to the lake, we have a lot of wind. Not so much wind in the classic sense, we get a little bit of that, but wind in the sense of our environment rapidly changes within a week. We can go from warm and damp to cool and sometimes even cool and dry in a pretty short number of days. And I do suspect at least, that this is why we see headaches that are so difficult to treat, migraines that are so difficult to treat, at least part of what we're dealing with here. External pathogenic factors, of course, play a role in external wind-cold invasion. Key symptoms, like we talked about, exposure to wind, we get a sharp and pulsating pain, often of the whole head. This is nasal congestion, clear discharge. This is a wind-cold invasion. We've talked about normal or pale, expect a thin white coat, pulse is floating. So when we see these things, this tells us, yeah, we're dealing with wind-cold invasion. Now this is not all wind-cold invasion. We've talked about a few other features in here, but now we're looking at wind-cold invasion. We're talking a little bit about treatments in this section as well. Treatments here, expel wind cold. Yep, pretty easy. Warm and tonify wei qi. We can say release the exterior. And moxa, warm foods, warm herbs. Guiji tang, which is our cinnamon combo, cinnamon formula, particularly good for expelling wind cold. Release the exterior, expel wind cold. Tends to work pretty well. Those are external factors. Where we spend more time, and really where we find the causes of most of the headaches that we see clinically, are internal disharmonies and internal patterns, mostly related to the liver. It's kind of like the liver should probably have a double underline here, because the majority of internal headaches are related to liver either being in excess or deficiency. And then we see the kidney and the spleen to a lesser degree. We also involve the heart. We'll see some of these patterns here. Liver yang rising. We didn't study this as a specific pattern. I think truthfully next year I will include it as a specific pattern, but it really is still more of a symptom, but it's such a big one that it creates other symptoms. Liver yang rising is when we have qi stagnation creating heat, added to other pathogenic factors of heat, emotional stress, frustration, ongoing repression, all of these things that injure the liver's ability to promote the smooth flow of qi. As qi stagnates under these conditions, and stress is definitely one of them, creating heat, transforms into a fire. Now that maybe is a little extreme because we've kind of reserved liver fire for more almost mania type patterns. But we can certainly call it, as almost always it is called, a liver yang rising. So the yang rises up so much and so quickly. So often liver yang rising is still considered a bit of a wind pattern because it gushes and it rushes upwards, and it disturbs the yang channels of the head. Anything that promotes heat in the liver, meds, drugs, alcohol, environmental exposures, these can all produce heat, and anytime we have heat injuring the liver. This can give us a liver yang rising. This is sort of your classic. It's not your cluster headaches like from stress, but these do play a role. This is sort of like you get a headache, but you're also feeling very frustrated, irritable, and you probably are likely to snap at someone. That's characteristic of liver yang rising. Headaches will go with that. Key symptoms, the type of headaches that we see here: pulsing or throbbing, pain behind the eyes, blurred vision, that's as it gets more significant, flushed face. So that's where we see some of that heat rising up, easy anger, red eyes, bitter taste in the mouth. If you see most of these or even half of these, almost certainly you're looking at a liver yang rising pattern headache. Let's take a look and see what we've come up with for the tongue here. Maybe normal if it's fairly acute, but probably you've got ongoing redness because you've got ongoing heat. You can certainly get liver yang rising all in one day, but most of the time, well, I think this is the same one where we looked at, that was the same one we looked at because it came up before. Red tongue, yellow coat. So we did try to look at this before. And likewise, I wasn't really satisfied, but this is actually probably a little more characteristic. You see a lot of darkness here. Yeah, this is the one I pulled up last time that really shows us some of that redness. But I want to see more yellow coat. That looks like that person's been drinking coffee. This maybe is our best example here. I guess that's not going to get much bigger, but this is where we see definite redness. Yeah, this is actually a pretty good example. If you see through here, through the liver and through the heart, if you've got heat in the liver, you're almost definitely going to injure the heart with that same heat. But we've got heat in here, and we've got a yellow coat. So this would probably be a pretty good example of a red tongue, yellow coat that we would likely see in someone who's prone to liver yang rising. Pulse is going to be, especially when this is happening. So if someone has a headache, because if you remember, the tongue tells us sort of what's been happening over the last few days, last couple of days at least. The pulse tells us what's happening right now. So if you've got a liver yang rising headache, expect to find full, rapid, I would even say wiry pulse unless they're otherwise quite deficient. But usually this is all a combination of an excess pattern. So expect during a liver yang rising headache, you're going to feel a full, rapid, wiry pulse. Next time you see someone who has acutely a headache, check the pulse because you'll find that you can notice some things you don't normally see if you just check sort of normal, otherwise kind of healthy people. Treatment. Treat the liver. Subdue liver yang, clear stagnation, clear heat. A lot of our Jing Well points, so these are the points usually at the tips of the fingernails and toenails. These are especially indicated for clearing heat. I also like to add in some auricular acupuncture here because I find this particularly useful. So auricular, oh boy, here's all the problems, all the formatting that comes in. So let's see if we can undo that. I don't know if I can. There we go. And let's add auricular ACPT, especially prick to bleed arteries. You guys are seeing how my typing skills are. I learned how to type on a typewriter, and I didn't do it especially well. I use both hands, but I'm not all that great at typing. True confessions during our video series. One of the things I often do to subdue liver yang, if we've got a full heat pattern, I like the Jing Well points. Yes, I would say I almost always do these. I also really like, in these situations, liver 1, 2, and 3 as ways to clear heat from the liver. That's really what we're focusing on, and these tend to work pretty well. Usually we can, if we see someone in a fairly acute liver yang rising headache, usually we can clear enough heat to get them pretty good relief. Okay, so that's liver yang rising as a pattern. Now we've got yin deficiency, liver, kidney, or heart yin deficiency. These patterns all lead to empty heat, which is similar to liver yang rising, but it's it's more mild. And some would say, well, a headache is still pretty painful, and it's not like this is always a 10 and this is always a 6. You can still have a pretty significant headache, but it is more mild and it's often more diffuse. The pain otherwise is fairly similar, though. Here I would expect to have a stronger pain, more throbbing, and here we might have a little bit less intense pain and a little less throbbing, but otherwise presentation fairly similar. The difference will be you will expect to see, and you'll probably, I've said this quite a few times, you'll know the difference between a full heat and an empty heat pattern when you see it in practice. The tongue is different, the pulse is different, but even just looking at the person, you can see this is different. You may see more wind here, dizziness, shakiness also likely, and that actually does show up pretty commonly. The tongue might be pale, expect red papules or redness at the tip. Now that usually tells us heat in the heart. We might see some transverse cracks as well. The coat will likely be dry. I didn't mention that above, but I probably should have. The coat up here is dark and yellow, and it's also, because there's so much heat, especially if it's an ongoing presentation, usually dry coat. Expect to see that. In a yin deficiency, the dryness is probably more pronounced because we actually are losing substance. We've injured fluids. We've probably injured fluids above, but expect to see dryness here. Let's see what our tongue picture we've got selected here comes up with. I think in this one I was trying to highlight papules and redness at the tip, so let's see what we have. Oh no, I just went in yin deficiency tongue. Yeah, that's not bad here, actually. Let's take a look at that one. Now this one, and I wouldn't say I see this as much, but we've got more cracks here. These are more longitudinal, and more commonly I see these being transverse cracks, but this is probably a good example of a yin deficient tongue. We can see that yellow coat still at the back, but otherwise this tongue's fairly dry. There's not much coat happening here. And we've got cracks. Cracks are where the heat comes through. We see cracks starting to show, little or no coating, that they've named that as well. And we've got a fair bit of heat here. Now, we don't even see headaches listed. These are more if you look at insomnia. Well, I guess irritable. This starts to get us into the liver as well. Menopause, changes in menstruation. This would be yin deficiency. This is pretty good. It's a pretty good example of a yin deficient tongue. This would be not uncommon to see in a patient who gets yin deficiency headaches. That is a nice tongue we've seen before. That's stomach yin deficiency. That's a good picture of stomach yin deficiency, actually. We see that empty heat at the tip. This tells us there's yin deficiency. We see papules coming through. We also just see congestion. This tells us that things are not working well. We even see a little bit of almost peeling in kind of that spleen stomach area there as well. That's a little off topic, but that's a useful tongue to look at. I haven't seen that one. There's probably a better picture of a yin deficient tongue. Yeah, this is pretty good actually. A little more stagnation than we might see otherwise, but we've got these cracks. These are cracks. This one's sort of semi-longitudinal, but these are those characteristic transverse cracks that we start to see. And here we've got really heat just kind of rimming everything. There's actually enough stagnation in here that I would say this is probably a great example of the type of tongue where we would see liver yin deficient patterns that give us headaches. So I'm pretty happy with that one there. As I'm sure you remember, in yin deficiency, expect to see a floating, rapid pulse. Floating and rapid. Floating tells us that we've got empty heat rising to the superficial layer. Rapid also tells us there's heat. Tense is where we bring the headache part into it. In a pattern of headaches, expect to see, anytime there's pain, which of course a headache is pain, expect to see tension in the pulse. Treatment, nourish yin, clear empty heat. It's actually that straightforward, and I know, again, sometimes you may want to see, all right, here's a list of points, here's a list of herbs, here's a collection of protocols I can do for this. The truth is, though, as I've said so many times, that's the easy part. I'm sure already you know how to say, okay, how do I nourish yin? And if we were in class live right now, I'd probably stop and do it again, and we'd say, all right, let's go to the chalkboard. How do we nourish yin? And you would say things like, we have to build blood, we have to build up substance. And that, how do we do that? We eat nourishing foods. We have warm cooked foods. We have nourishing things like bone broth. It builds blood. It builds yin. How do we clear empty heat? We clear empty heat mostly through nourishing yin. And then if we talk about herbs, we use herbs that are slightly cooling and yin building. So Ramanya, always a great herb because it builds yin, and because it's cooling, it clears heat. Now you want to get that balance right. We talked about this when we talked about our different herbs and our different formulas, the balance between nourishing yin to clear heat, but if you over-nourish yin, if your formula is not well balanced, you can actually go too far, and that's especially true in yin deficiency. If you clear too much empty heat, you leave the person feeling cold. You don't want to do that. All right, there is our liver, kidney, and heart yin deficiency. Let's look at kidney yang deficiency. There are a couple things in here. One, this is really more advanced. If you've got a deficiency of kidney over time, the kidney's failing to promote the brain. I don't know about that one as much as something that I've seen, but it certainly shows up often enough that I'll include it. Usually if we're saying there's a headache from kidney yang deficiency, it's because of the accumulation of cold phlegm leading to obstruction. This is, particularly in people who have chronic kidney yang deficiency, this is definitely a pattern that we see fairly regularly. Expect to see dull, heavy headaches due to phlegm and dampness. Sinus congestion, these might also be some of the patterns that we see in sinus congestion. This could also be where we start to see some migraine patterns as well. If we're progressing to the level where the Zheng qi, so that's like the kidney yang, kidney jing, plus the wei qi has become deficient, we're getting accumulation of dampness and phlegm in ways that it might hang out. That might be where we start to talk about chronic sinus infections that lead to chronic sinus congestion that give us that headache. So the tongue here, expect it to be pale and swollen. You might see some of that purple-blue. You might not, but expect to see signs of cold here. This is a kidney, pale, swollen tongue. Oh, that's perfect right there. Oh, these are great ones. Okay. We've got several nice-looking pale, swollen tongues here. Let's pull up this one. That is possibly slightly deviated, but that might just be the picture. This is a pale, swollen, white tongue. This is what the tongue looks like in kidney yang deficiency. If this progressed much further, we'd see a little thicker white coat back here. It might be a little more behind there, but we can't quite get to it. But this is definitely, if not, this is probably, I think I could pretty confidently say this is going to be a spleen yang deficiency tongue. And I suspect this is probably progressing to kidney yang deficiency. We could probably say, if we wanted to, this is spleen yang deficiency, and we'll know it's starting to go to kidney yang deficiency as the coat back here starts to thicken. Let's see, there are a couple other nice looking tongues I wanted to look at here. This one also is pretty good. This one we can definitely see signs of cold because we can see some darkness, almost that blue, very, very swollen here. But you can see, if you look at the edges and around here, it's pale underneath. This area here, definitely you can see that paleness. But here we've got that congestion, that cold stasis pattern, this thicker white coat. This would be, oh, this is also for Matsuocha. This is, oh, here we go. A swollen tongue indicates phlegm. I would agree with that. This suggests to me that we've got cold phlegm starting to accumulate, probably from kidney yang deficiency. Expect to see a tongue that looks like that and a pulse that is slow, slippery. I would even say probably deep, but we might not always see that. But slow and slippery, you pretty much have to see that if it's a kidney yang deficiency. Treatment: nourish kidney, qi, and yang, clear dampness and phlegm. Moxa is not just useful, I would say it would be an error to not include it. Warming treatments here are the order of the day. Nourish and warm the kidneys. How do you do that? You do that through food. You nourish the spleen and the kidney yang at the same time through warm cooked foods. You use warming, moving herbs. Lots of ways to treat a kidney yang deficiency. Often something we can do quite well to the degree that we're able. An older person, it's a little harder because the kidneys are already in decline. And a young person with a kidney yang deficiency, we have to use strong approaches. We've talked about this quite a few times. You have to match. There are two factors that determine the intensity of your treatment. One is the vitality of the patient, and the other is the strength of the pathogenic factor. Pathogenic factor in this case is cold phlegm, and the vitality of the patient may be quite weak if they're deficient in qi and yang. So you have to try to, again, find that balance. That would go right here. How do you nourish qi and yang, and how do you clear a heavy pathogenic factor without overwhelming someone? However, you can do it. It definitely takes time, though. If someone's progressed to a kidney yang deficiency, plan for it to be slow, persistent work, but work that is possible and results that are hopefully achievable. It's always dependent on many factors. Often the engagement level of the patient is one of the main factors that we see here. Blood and Qi deficiency is actually a very common cause of headaches that we see in practice, usually associated with the failure of the spleen to build Qi and blood. How many times are we going to say that? So many times, because it's so important. If you do not intake or uptake the nutrition that you need to build Qi and blood, nothing else can properly happen in the body. So we see this, a deficiency of Qi, and particularly blood, will give us a failure of Qi and blood to nourish the brain. This often gives us those empty pattern headaches. We may see this behind the eyes and at the vertex, indicating more of a liver blood deficiency. The pain is almost always dull, aching, and persistent. Pale, swollen, dry coat. Let's see if we've got a picture there to take a look at. And we'll see this pretty reliably. This is sort of like, though, are we really talking about headaches or are we talking about something out of balance? So yeah, pale, swollen tongue. This is the same pictures we just looked at. Same pattern here, Qi and blood deficiency. And there are lots of great examples. That's a great example there. That's a Qi and blood deficient tongue. Swollen, pale, dry coat, really no whiteness. So this hasn't progressed to a yang deficiency yet, but this is definitely a Qi and blood deficient tongue. So is this. That's a nice one. See this really starting to get shiny. Maybe little hints of yin starting to happen here. Blood deficiency progressing to a yin deficiency. That same thing. These are all, this whole series here, pretty good. Look at pale and deficient tongues. And these are tongues you'll see all the time. So one of the things I like about being able to do these video lectures is we can actually just pull up immediate examples and I can say, yep, it looks like this. Also looks like this. A little less blood deficiency and a little more spleen Qi deficient here. Also looks like this. We saw this one before. Definitely a swollen tongue telling us we have dampness. This peeling tells us things are progressing. And here's another picture. This one definitely cold, starting to accumulate. This is pale, turning to bluish. So you can see these differences in the tongues here. Pale, swollen coat is dry. Some would even say absent. This is what we often see in blood and Qi deficiency. This is common enough. How do you treat this? You build blood. You do the best you can. We might, I don't know if I actually have it in here or not, but we have some general points. Maybe I'll add it as we get there. Some general points to treat headaches that are often useful, but if you have blood and Qi deficiency, the best you can do is usually pain relief, and it's usually fairly temporary. The most valuable thing you can do, of course, build blood, nourish Qi, warm foods, moxa. I feel like I could almost write to you guys at this point, etc., because you should be so familiar with, okay, how do we build Qi and blood? Yes, here's how we build Qi and blood. You should know how to do that. It's what we do every day in practice, and it's certainly foundational. That idea, I showed you guys once in class, the alternate five elements theory that put earth at the center, and that resonates with me because you have to have earth element being digestion and absorption. You have to have that at the center in order to be able to build blood and Qi and do just about everything else that the body does. All right, let's look at obstruction, stasis, stagnation, dampness, and phlegm. We could just say, oh, as we did, obstruction. These are the things that cause obstruction. Any influence creating stagnation or obstruction will impair the flow of Qi and blood to the head. A lot of headaches, that's what we're dealing with. Now, this can range from acute overeating, particularly damp and greasy foods. We can see the kind of plaques we see in atherosclerosis, leading to actual obstruction of the vessels that we can check. Or, don't forget about this, chronically tight muscles of the neck and shoulders. These will impair the flow of Qi and blood to the head. So we get a lot of patterns of headaches that are from obstruction. Key symptoms will depend on the cause. Generally presents as more intense pain, often of a fixed location. Where's the headache? It's right here. Where's the pain? Right here. Sometimes they'll point to an area and it's actually mostly musculoskeletal pain. It's less headache and more it hurts where these muscles attach or it hurts where these muscles are tight. Same thing, liver areas, we expect to see this. These are the most common areas of pain in this pattern. Dark tongue. Yes, where there is obstruction, expect to find a dark tongue. Let's see if we can pull one up here. That was our pale tongue. There, oh yeah, we've seen this picture a couple times now. Dark tongue. There's a great example of a dark tongue. Purplish blue, so this is a little more cold pattern, but that's a dark tongue. So is that. That's quite a dark tongue. There is This is beyond just qi stagnation. This is definitely a blood stasis pattern. So we've got very much a case of obstruction and blood stasis in this tongue. Here we probably see some heat. This actually looks like the color's a little off in this picture. This looks a little unnaturally purple. I haven't talked about this. There's a pale tongue. I haven't talked about this much in class, but some practitioners do take a look at the vessels underneath the tongue, and they say the more engorged they are, the more purple they are, the more stagnant someone is. I don't know if I fully buy that. I don't know if I've seen that correlate enough that I use it in practice. Most TCM practitioners that I know don't do that as much, but certainly a handful do. So I don't want to say it's not useful, but it's not a necessary part of it. This is a little weird. I don't even want to get into what's happening here. It's funny what you see when you search things. Okay, that is what we'll look at for our tongue there. Expect the tongue to be dark. Treatment principle. Let's talk about the pulse, of course. Full wiry, possibly slippery. This will depend on what else is happening, but these are, especially if you catch it during the acute phase of a headache, these are going to be full excess patterns. Treatment principles: resolve stagnation, clear, heat, or cold. Cupping and trigger point are often especially helpful. When you see these patterns of headaches, sometimes doing the trigger point can actually provide so much relief that it's a little bit jarring. It's kind of like you open things up too fast and they get almost a reflexive headache to the headache they already had because the blood flow changes. Sometimes, though, more often, we see quite significant relief. So I would say trigger point and cupping. I would do mild, though. I wouldn't go full extreme pattern here because it might overwhelm someone, but cupping and trigger point are very helpful in usually ameliorating obstructive pattern headaches. And I think the last one that we'll look at here, and then I will talk about some general points, I'll add that just for fun. Failure of the heart to control vessels. This is seen as the qi of the heart and the kidneys weakens and becomes deficient. This is usually what we see: overwork, undernourishment. Now this is getting us into qi and blood deficiency, somewhere around there. But these are also our dull, persistent headaches, especially around the temples. Sometimes they have a constricting headband quality. Because the heart controls the vessels, and we know that the regulation of the vessels that creates the flow of blood to the head is a major player in creating headaches. This is where we have to say the heart and the kidneys play a role. When the qi of these two is weak, we see a failure to properly optimize the flow of blood to the head, and we get these patterns of headache. These are usually weak but also tense, probably deep. Build the qi of the heart and kidneys. This is like saying adaptogens and rest and rebalance your work life and all of these things. These are dull, persistent headaches that people get most days. Usually the cause is low, ongoing stress. How we treat it, sometimes a little more difficult, but as your heart and your kidney qi weakens, and we've talked about these often, and I'm really into catching patterns of heart and kidney qi deficiency so that we can treat those at the earliest signs so that a further, more difficult pattern doesn't progress. Okay. So those are the patterns that we most commonly see for headaches. Let's add in here general treatment for, you're going to have to bear with me on my typing, general treatment for headaches. Let's turn off the bold and let's add some points. Liver 3, Li 4. These are great. These are the points that open and move. Even in a deficiency case, which sometimes you don't want to use these moving points, if they're acutely in a headache, add these points in. Triple warmer 5 is pretty good to release the exterior, and Li11 is pretty much a staple because that also releases and clears. You'll see some of these look like points we've seen previously because they're points that help relieve pain from the body. So far this is fairly general at relieving pain. I can't help it. I really like Yao Tong Zhui. This isn't necessarily on everyone's list. Just find these points are so good at releasing. Similarly add in gallbladder 42. I like those. Specific to the head, there are a couple of approaches. Some people say in excess patterns mostly treat the feet, and in deficiency patterns mostly treat the head. I've heard that, I've read that, some practitioners like that. I don't know if I'm as convinced by that. I would say most of the time do generally treat points on the feet, but there are points on the head that are probably good for all patterns of headaches. We're going to add some of these in here. You probably already can guess most of these: yin, tong, and tai, yang. These ones are pretty reliably good for treating headaches. I would say GV20, and this is needled back in excess, excess and forward in deficiency. The idea of this being you either want to push the yang back down, or at least prevent the yang from rising. That's when you would needle it backwards in excess patterns, and in conditions of deficiency you actually want to lift the qi to the head. You want to bring more qi and yang to clear the head. If you're not sure what to do, just put it straight in. That's also fine. These tend to be pretty good points to use here. This one, usually quite useful, gallbladder 20 and 21. Gallbladder 20 and 21. These ones are also quite useful, and although we've seen this one as well, Anmian, this can be useful. These are useful as points, but I don't remember if that's with an E or an A. I remember there was a drug a few years ago that has a similar name, but it's the Anmian point. And this one, often because of its location and its proximity to some of the origins and insertions of the muscles that often get tight. So these would be some general points you can use for headaches. I'm sure there's a few others you could include here that some practitioners would say, oh, no, if you're treating headaches, you have to do that. That would be fine as well. There's lots of room for different opinions here. But I would say if you saw a pattern of a headache and you did pretty much all these points, that would at least get you started. And then what you want to do from here is say, okay, well, if it's related to the kidneys, I'd probably add kidney 3. If it's related to congestion, I'd probably add spleen 3. If we've got a deficiency pattern, I'd probably add moxa. If we've got obstruction, I'd probably add cupping or some trigger points. So this could be a good, reasonable base treatment. And then from there, you want to, as we mentioned, I think in the very first sentence of this section, you always want to try to identify the underlying causes or patterns, therefore treatment flows from there. Okay, that is our video lecture on headaches. Hope you found that useful. Hope that gives you some information you can put into practice. As I mentioned in a couple of videos, if you have comments or if I've missed something, say, hey, how come you didn't do that? Just either add that below or let me know, and we can talk about why you may or may not do something like that. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Enjoy the rest of your day.